Call the Workshop-Orono and Veazie Town Councils to order. We have Orono councilors on this side of the table, and for those who don't know them, our town manager Sophie Wilson, Cheryl Robertson, Jeff Wingard, Terry Grenier, and Laura Mitchell. I always want to say the wrong name. And we're joined by Mark, Leonard, and Megan is joining us remotely. And we're pleased to have Boyd Smith here, who is the superintendent of the water district. Our purpose tonight is to gather some information on the issue of fluoridation of our water in the Orono-Veazie Water District. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Tom. Yeah, they're both fine. I think you want to recognize Paul Messer, who is a counselor from Veazie, and Mr. Bruin, Phil Bruin, who's also a counselor from Veazie. They're electronic.
okay, Paul Mesper and Phil Bruin are joining us remotely. We have an agenda. Our agenda includes the staff overview of legal authority and responsibilities regarding fluoridation of public water supply. Then information and presentation from invited guests, both for and against fluoridation. Then opportunity for council discussion and a comment period. And then we will decide if we're going to take any next steps. So with that said, I guess we're ready to move on to staff overview of legal authority and responsibility regarding fluoridation of the public water.
So it's very unusual that town council talks about public water. Every once in a while, we are in a position where we need to appoint representatives to the Orono-Veazie Water District Board of Trustees. But beyond that, most of the time, the water is handled through the water district. So back in November of 2019, the town council was approached by an Orono resident who wanted to talk about removing fluoride from the water system. So understanding that good fences make good neighbors, I immediately sent that person to see Boyd because it's water, and Boyd immediately sent them back because the town councils, the municipal officers in the communities are the ones that control the referendum process for any discussion of adding or removing fluoride from the water system. So it's important to understand that under state law, only the residents by vote can determine whether to add or remove water from a public water supply. Looking at our records, it appears that a vote was held in March of 1961 to that added fluoride to the water supply. And since that time, the water district has done what the voters have asked and have added hydrofluoric acid. There we go. Fluoride to the system. As we kind of work through this system, we received some legal advice. There are two ways that this question can come before the voters. The most streamlined way would be if both councils agreed to simultaneously hold election. That election can only happen at a general election. So the next time that could happen would be November of 2022. If the councils decided not to do that, the law does allow for a petition process. That petition process has a pretty high bar that people need to meet to compel a referendum to be called. So the question for the council is whether or not it's in the public interest to put this question out to vote. Each community needs to make that decision formally, independently. And if both communities agree to move forward, a vote would be held. The ballots are counted between both communities, and the majority of opinion on the votes cast will determine whether or not it would pass or fail. The votes also are cast by any registered voter within that municipality. They do not need to be on the public water supply. The argument there is that it's the public interest goes beyond the people who are specifically served as customers. We didn't want to bog down. I can go further in greater depth if you need, but that's the framework of tonight.
Thank you. Folks, I think we're ready to have some presentations by folks who are going to speak in favor of removing fluoride and in favor of keeping it the way it is. And I think we're being joined online by Paul Cornett. Is that correct? I think you're muted, sir.
How about that?
You're good. So I think the guidelines here are that we're going to allow about 15 minutes for each side. We suggested people could bring as many or as few folks as they wanted to speak. So we're ready for you to go right ahead, Mr. Cornett.
Okay, I'd like to share my PowerPoint with you, if I may. Do you see that?
No.
No? Okay, can you I'm going to ask to share screen at the bottom here. All righty. Share. How about that? Can you see anything now?
Yeah.
Is that, am I on screen?
Wow.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to argue why Orono should end water fluoridation. It should never have started. Back in the 1940s, they had no medical studies of any significance on the table when the US Public Health Service endorsed fluoridation in 1950, before any trials had been completed. And after that, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy as organization after organization followed the Public Health Service lead. And it's continued to this day with more emphasis on promotion from the US government agencies than actually studying the issue until relatively recently. And that's the subject of most of my talk tonight. I obtained my first degree from Cambridge, my PhD in chemistry from Dartmouth. I taught chemistry at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, from '83 to 2006. I specialized in environmental chemistry and toxicology. I co-authored the book, The Case Against Fluoride, in 2010, 80 pages of references. Every single argument was backed up with references to the literature. I'm currently the executive director of the Fluoride Action Network, which I helped to found in the year 2000. That's our webpage, and anything that I talk about tonight that you want more backup, you'll find it at that webpage. Some basic common sense arguments. Using the water supply to deliver any medicine, let alone fluoride, any medicine, is a poor practice, because once you put the medicine in the water, you can't control the dose, you can't control who gets it. It goes to everyone, regardless of age, health status, nutritional status. There's no oversight by a professional for the individual, and it violates the individual's right to informed consent. Now, fluoride is not a nutrient. There's not one process in the human body that has been shown to need fluoride. As far as tooth decay is concerned, the fluoride's action with the teeth is topical. It works on the outside of the tooth, not from inside the body. And even fluoridation promoters like the CDC admit that the benefit is mainly topical. And for those who want fluoride, obviously topical treatments like fluoridated toothpaste are readily available, which incidentally is what most of the world does. 97% of Europe, for example, use that approach. The fluoride ion is very toxic. That's what's concerned me for over 20 years. It's essentially incompatible with human biochemistry. For chemists, it forms a strong hydrogen bond. It forms complexes with every metal ion except the group 1 metal ions. It therefore interferes with all kinds of processes, including enzymes. And that's why certain lower creatures like bacteria, fungi, and some plants have proteins that pump fluoride out of their cells. These are called FEX proteins, fluoride export proteins. And if you want to read more about that, Ron Breaker at Yale University pioneered this work starting in 2012. Then an additional defense for human beings is the kidney. The kidney gets rid of about 50% of the fluoride that we take in from any source each day. And the rest is also, we have another defense mechanism, which is to sequester it in the bones. We look after fluoride rather the way we look after lead. We take it out of the bloodstream, put it into the bones, keeping it away from the soft tissues and the delicate biochemistry of the cell. Now, another defense, particularly for babies, is that mother's milk seems to be a filter. It doesn't allow much fluoride to enter the breast milk. It's extremely low, 0.004 parts per million. And so, in essence, mother's breast milk is protecting the newborn baby from fluoride. But that protection is removed when the baby is given fluoridated tap water to make up the formula. Now, a bottle-fed baby in a fluoridated community at 0.7 parts per million is getting 175 times that number, 0.004 parts per million. And from 1996, when my wife first got me involved, when I learned that, I thought this was a reckless thing to do. We should have listened to what nature said the baby needed. We didn't. We forced fluoride on the baby, and we're now finding out the consequences. A recent US government funded studies, these are high quality studies, the best to date, indicate that fluoridated water poses unacceptable risk to the developing brain. For some reason, let me see. First, please note, fluoride can cross the placental membrane. There's no defense for the fetus during pregnancy, no defense from fluoride. It can get in, and the youngest human being is confronted with fluoride. Also note that the blood-brain barrier is not fully developed until early infancy. So the newborn infant is also threatened by fluoride. Now, the latest science is very important. A huge change in the quality of studies when the US government started to fund studies. You know, to get NIH funding, it's extremely rigorous. You have to pass all kinds of rigorous design of your study to get that millions of dollars of funding. Anyway, the studies from Bashash in 2017, Green 2019 until 2020 showed that fluoride lowers IQ at the levels at which we fluoridate, the doses that people are getting in fluoridated communities like Arona. Fluoride also increases ADHD symptoms. Two important studies, recent studies on that. And thirdly, fluoride increases hip fractures in post-menopausal women. That's a study from Sweden, a very well designed study, and they found an increase in the hip fractures at the very same natural levels of fluoride that we fluoridate in the United States. So anyone reading these high quality studies with an open mind would realize that continuing fluoridation, at least in my view, is reckless. And I want to just give a few more details of some of these studies. The Bashash study was a mother-child study. The mother's exposure was measured by measuring her fluoride in her urine on an individual basis, and the IQ of the offspring was also measured on an individual basis. And the IQ loss increased as the maternal urine fluoride increases. Green essentially replicated this study in Canada. More details in a moment on that. Until it also in Canada found that bottle-fed babies had lowered IQ if they were bottle-fed in fluoridated communities versus non-fluoridated communities. So based upon these three studies, the estimated IQ loss in fluoridated communities ranges from 2 to 7 IQ points. A loss of 1 IQ point reduces lifetime earnings by $18,000. That's a figure used by the US EPA. At the population level, a shift down of 5 IQ points reduces the number of very bright children with an IQ above 130 by 50% and increases the number of children needing special care with an IQ less than 70 by about 57%. So basically, you don't see an impact necessarily on the average child, not a huge impact, a loss of 100 to 95, not noticeable by a parent or a school teacher, but at the wings, you're having a devastating impact on your population, on your ability to earn money, invent things and so on, and then looking after socially handicapped people. In my view, this is extremely serious. And no amount of reduced tooth decay could possibly justify damaging children's brains and limiting their development in this way. Now, Philippe Grandjean, who some of you may know as one of the world's experts on mercury's neurotoxicity, did a benchmark dose analysis using the data from the Green study and the Bashash study. And the benchmark dose analysis was designed to predict a level of fluoride that you could have exposure in pregnancy, which would protect against a drop of 1 IQ point. At what level would you lower with maternal urine levels of a pregnant woman with fluoride? What level would you need to lower the IQ by 1 IQ point? This is the paper, and it was co-authored by many of the authors of the Bashash and the Till studies. And what Grandjean found was to protect against a 1 IQ point loss in offspring, mother's urine should not exceed 0.2 parts per million or 0.2 milligrams per liter. And 1 part per million is 5 times higher than this, and 0.7 parts per million is 3.5 times higher than this. So based upon what Grandjean is doing here, is a typically fluoridated community, you're talking a loss of 4 or 5 IQ points. So I think in a few minutes, a few more details on these studies. The Bashash study was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is the in-house organ of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, a leading journal in its field. This was a 12-year, multi-million-dollar study funded by the EPA, the NIH, and the NIEHS. The authors came from many prestigious institutions. They examined approximately 300 mother-offspring pairs. Both exposure and outcomes were determined on an individual basis, not an ecological or a community basis, individuals. And the mother's exposure to fluoride during pregnancy was determined via analysis of the urine. And that's important because the urine levels give you a value, a number independent of the source. So it could have come from toothpaste, it could have come from food, it could have come from salt, it could have come from water. It doesn't matter. You've got a measure of the total exposure of the woman to fluoride during exposure. And that allows you to compare with other communities and other countries if you have that number, the mother's urine levels for fluoride. They controlled for every conceivable confounding factor, which is what you'd expect with an NIH-funded study. The study results, the IQ of the women's children was measured at 4 and at 6 to 12. For every 1 milligram per liter increase in mother's urine level, the children lost an average of 5 to 6 IQ points. That's a very large effect. And basically, that envelope there, the pink envelope, shows the spread of the data. The red line is the best line fit. The bottom axis there is the typical range of maternal urine fluoride for women in the United States. And for that range, you're looking at a loss of 6 IQ points, comparing lowest urine to highest urine. Green study in 2019 essentially replicated this study, but in children in Canada. The first study was done in a cohort from Mexico City. Now, there was one big difference with the green study. The loss of IQ occurred in the boys, but not in the girls, as far as urine levels were concerned. But when the authors measured other exposures to the women, estimated from the amount of water they drank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then both girls and boys lost IQ points as a function of fluoride. And the suggestion that has been made is that boys are more sensitive during utero and girls are more sensitive immediately after birth, during infancy. Now, this article was published in the JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, Pediatrics, again, one of the world's leading journals of pediatrics. And the authors actually had two of the editors of JAMA had a 20-minute podcast where they discussed the significance of this paper, because they knew it was a bombshell. They knew it. They knew it was going to cause a lot of controversy. They themselves said they had no idea in their medical training that fluoride caused any health effects at all. And this one was quite a serious one. And towards the end of the podcast, and I do urge you to listen to it, they said that if their wife was pregnant, they would recommend that she did not drink fluoridated water. The Till study, and I will end with this, Christine Till from the University of York near Toronto. Their children were bottle fed as babies. They compared children who were bottle fed as babies in fluoridated communities compared to children who were bottle fed in non-fluoridated communities. And that's the only difference between these two groups of children, that whether they were bottle fed with fluoridated water or not. And the IQ loss was quite staggering. For 9 IQ points lost for full scale IQ for each 1 milligram per liter increase in tap water. And remember, it was 5 to 6 for the maternal exposure. And then for performance scale, full scale, 19 IQ points. These again, staggering losses. And it's hard to believe that with such well-funded and published in such prestigious journals, that there are going to be major problems with these studies. And because the outcome is so incredibly serious, limiting the future, not of 1 or 2 children, but all our children, potentially, I think the precautionary principle must kick in. In my view, we have to err on the side of safety here, on the idea of protecting children. And as far as protecting teeth are concerned, as I mentioned, topical treatments are readily accessible out there, and most of the world have used that approach, and particularly well done in Scotland with their Child Smile program, which was started in Glasgow and aimed at low-income children. So there are very concrete, cost-effective alternatives if you should choose to stop this, as I hope you will. Thank you very much.
Appreciate your presentation and your time.
Thank you.
So, let's move up here, folks. I beg your pardon?
Sitting down. Stand up.
Sure, whatever you like.
I have to speak up for that? Yes, you do. Have to project. All right. Gave up my outside voice a long time ago. Thank you for having us. My name's Judy Feinstein, and I am here
in my capacity as the coordinator of the Maine Oral Health Coalition, which is a network of some 200 individuals and a number of organizations, and we've been working to promote better oral health in Maine for over 20 years. I should also tell you that until 6 years ago, I worked in the Maine CDC and directed the state's oral health program. I'm not a dentist. I have a public health background. And one of the things that has always been part of the work that I did was preventing disease. And this is Patrick Rowe. He is a dentist, recently established in Orono. But I should also tell you that I first met Patrick about 13 years ago when he was in Vermont. He's the clinician and I'm not. So I just really don't even attempt to answer questions about clinical dentistry. It's not a good thing to do. So you can go ahead. Are you gonna run that?
Yeah, you just tell right into owl.
Oh, next slide, please. The owl knows to do that.
Yes, well, it's Bell behind the owl, but.
Oh, all right. I'm on the planning board where I live in Caldwell, and believe me, we don't have anything this sophisticated. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So we just wanted to give a little bit of background. We want to start with some basic statistics, the history of fluoridation, and using fluorides to help prevent tooth decay. Talk about our understanding of how it works and its effectiveness, and offer some detail on a couple questions and concerns that come up. And then we'll certainly be happy to have questions from you, either today or following up afterwards. So this slide is sort of an overview. 73% of people using public systems means that the percentage of the US population receiving fluoridated water works out to about 63%. It's the adjustment of fluoride that occurs naturally in a community's water supply to the recommended level for preventing tooth decay. From my experience and knowledge, and Dr. Rowe's as well, fluoride added to community drinking water has been shown to be safe, inexpensive, and an extremely effective method of helping to prevent tooth decay. Nothing is 100%. That's why I say helping to prevent tooth decay. Community water fluoridation was recognized as one of the 10 great public health achievements in the 20th century, and we still think so. And one of the most important things is that this provides benefits to everybody in the community, regardless of their age, their socioeconomic status, their ability to access the healthcare system, and a number of other factors like that. And it provides, I just said that, provides protection for people with limited access to care. And that's important in a rural state like Maine. We'll go to the next one, please. So let's see, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you move the faces? Yeah. Should be.
Oh, no, that's not what I meant.
Anyway, what the slide says is that about 79.3% of people in Maine receive tap water that's fluoridated. And since only about 49% of our population use public water supplies, this means that overall about 40% of people in this state have fluoridated drinking water in their homes. In Maine, as across the country, the percentage of the total population is a result of the process used to authorize it, which Sophie explained. It's local in Maine and some other states. There's another process. If you're interested, you can ask me afterwards. And then the fact that many people do not get their water from public water supplies. They have wells. Even in a community that's fluoridated, there are always people who are beyond the water lines, and they're getting water from their own sources. So it's a community level public health measure. Go to the next one, please.
So I'll just jump in here for a minute. So often when I've spoken with patients in the past, there's been a misperception that fluoride is something unnatural that gets added to the water. And just through this slide, and just to remind us all that it is a naturally occurring element. It's present in the groundwater in many places. When I was in Vermont working with the majority of my patients on well water, a fair number of them had fluoride in their wells. Sometimes it was the optimal level. Sometimes it was much higher than we'd like to see, and we'd have to kind of work to reduce that. And then depending on where they lived, you could almost predict certain areas of mountains, there was no fluoride at all. Certain areas down in the plains where there's a lot of limestone, there's higher fluoride. And we started using fluoridation because of a natural experiment that occurred with a town in Colorado, where most of the people in the town, the folks who grew up there, had really terribly brown stained teeth, but they didn't have any tooth decay. And it's called Colorado brownstone. And over time, scientists discovered that it was actually fluoride that was causing that. And it was fluoride at incredibly high levels in groundwater, much, much higher than what we would ever use for a public water system. So they were able to say, okay, there's this anti-cavity benefit, but then how do we adjust that down to an optimal level? And over time, that's been adjusted. And right now, it's 0.7 is what the US CDC considers to be the optimal level of fluoridation. And I believe that's what we have in our Orno Veazie water district. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and both, the next two are kind of background on that, so we're not going to go into that. Just one thing to tell you, for people who don't know, I find this helpful, is that 1 part per million is equivalent to 1 inch in 16 miles. It's really a very, very small amount, or 1 minute in 2 years. We're not talking about a large amount of fluoride being used relative to the quantity of water. And the next one. And so there was, as Patrick said, there were some natural experiments in Maine almost 70 years ago. Norway was the first community to start fluoridating, and then there were several other communities in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Maine. A whole bunch of them in the mid-60s. Go ahead, please. So this is a bit on how fluoride works. There's a topical effect, as Dr. Connick was talking about, and there's also a systemic effect, but there's a synergy between those two effects. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just talking a little bit about my personal experience with having practiced. I started my career practicing in larger communities, bigger cities. As Judy mentioned, I then moved to Vermont, and I was there for about 10 years. I'm here now because my wife got a job at the university, and we're thrilled to be here. In fact, so thrilled that somehow I got moved into the school board position. You know, it was really surprising to me when I moved to an area where there wasn't fluoride in the water. In a much smaller town in Arona, we didn't have a fluoridated water system, and then again, most of my patients were on well water. I was shocked at the amount of care I saw, and it was just kind of normal there. I've been pleased to say that since I've been practicing here, with, again, the majority of my patients with fluoridated water, at least those that aren't in rural areas, has seen a big decrease. And so just, you know, one dentist anecdote is not science, right? But just from personal experience, I've really noticed a difference in the different communities where I practice. And I would hate to start to see, you know, kids and adults, everything deteriorates compared to what I saw in other places.
And when I worked in the state oral health program, we had a handout that we would give the school nurses to send home with the parents. And it was, you're nodding your head, you had kids in that program? Okay, well, we called it the inside-outside story. So the initial effect by being able to drink fluoridated water for very young children while the teeth are forming under the gums makes the enamel stronger. But then after about the age of 8, when all the baby teeth have erupted into the mouth, have come out in the mouth, and the permanent teeth are already forming in the gums, a lot of the effect is in fact topical. But the systemic effect doesn't go away, it just becomes smaller. So it's a matter of how shifting that effect. Just at the time, I want to make sure we get through this. This one? There's some, go ahead to the next one, please. Who am I talking to? Is somewhere else?
Well, yeah,
Oh, all right, it's so weird. So we just want to remind you, and I think you probably all know, or you wouldn't be doing the work that you're doing here tonight, is about tooth decay and oral health. Tooth decay is a winnable battle. This is one of the most preventable diseases that that all of us have. Almost, I don't know that anybody manages to get through their life without some dental disease. Even people who haven't had decay, as young people, we're going to get a gum recession and be susceptible to decay at the roots. So this is a chronic disease. This is something that can be prevented. Kids with poor oral health are about 3 to 4 times more likely to earn lower grades, to miss more school. 3 in 10, or about at least 30% of adults, low-income adults, say would be parents of their mouth and teeth, affects their ability to interview for a job. And stories like this were instrumental in the Maine legislature agreeing this past session to expand our Medicaid program to cover care for adults. That's going to start next July. It's going to be expensive when it starts because there's a unmet need, but it's going to really help a lot of people get good, better jobs and keep those jobs and perform better at work. What else do I want to tell you here? Oral health is a window to your overall health. If you can ask your family physician, but one of the things they really look at is the condition of the teeth and what that does for nutrition. If you have an infection in your mouth, you can have a low-grade fever. It's going to affect your daily life. There's a relationship between people who have diabetes and their ability to control their A1C and periodontal disease, because there's an infection and inflammation process that makes it very difficult for the diabetic treatments to work properly. Can go to the next one real quick. Yeah, we've already said this, but fluoridation does reduce tooth decay by 25% over a lifetime. It's not going to be a reduction that somebody's going to see in 2 years. It's over a lifetime. This used to be cited as a higher number, but with more exposures and more use of toothpaste, the benefit that can be attributed to water fluoridation alone is now being estimated at about 25%. But that's a lot. It may not be much for an individual, but when you look at a whole community, that is a lot. And in public health, we're concerned about community level impact. Next one. Pretty much the same thing, but there was also this concept that water fluoridation doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter if you can get to a dentist's office or see a hygienist twice a year or once every 2 years, the benefit of water fluoridation is there. And that return on investment is an interesting concept because again, that doesn't ascribe to the individual. It's what the community will benefit by. And that's a new concept in looking at this community investment. Next one. What we wanted to talk about a little bit too was that treating something that's eminently preventable is you're spending money that you didn't have to spend. It challenges families. It's a challenge to the taxpayer, therefore. Progression of decay goes from a single filling through to maybe repairing that filling to a crown, even to an implant. you can't see, but because I'm wearing a mask, but I happen, for reasons that don't matter here, to have 8 crowns. And I live in fear of needing implants, because that would be a financial disaster. So, under this slide is a one personally. So, and when we talk about a challenge or a burden, it's not, it's just our low-income population, the people who get their care through Maine Care. I'm very fortunate, and I just said to you what a burden it would be to replace those forms. So we wanted to make that point. Everybody feels that. Next one, please. Yeah, so we did want to point this out, that we know that tooth decay increases after people stop water fluoridation. In Juneau, they stopped adding water, fluoride to the water in 2007. And they looked at their Medicaid claims and found that they were looking at 1 additional procedure per child per year. So expand that over cumulative for 3 years. That's three dental procedures, 3 fillings that then have to be taken care of. This was where Patrick was going to talk about the differences that he thought in the communities he's worked in, and I jumped the gun on it. So,
The only thing that I would say about this is that, historically, we see a decrease in decay in the past when communities went to adding fluoridation. Yes, that was in the days before fluoride toothpaste, we saw these big huge decreases. But I think it's just as important to look at these cases of what happened when the fluoride was stopped. These aren't hypotheticals. This isn't saying like, well, there's toothpaste now, we have other ways of addressing this. We saw real increases in these communities when fluoridation was stopped. And so it's not just a hypothetical thought experiment. This is real. We just don't want to see it again.
so the information that was available to me said that in Calgary, Western Canada, stopped fluoridating, I think in about 2011. They saw this huge increase in 3 years of monitoring the care rates among kids. Calgary voted last week, took last Monday. It's not binding. They call it a plebiscite. So it's to direct the government to restart fluoridation, and the vote was 62 to 38%. So overwhelming. That's a big majority. Next slide. What about 5 more minutes? I don't have that. So from the information that is available to me, we see that the research confirms fluoridation safety. This idea of random clinical trials or trials doesn't work on populations. You really can't. It's not, especially retroactively, to do that kind of trial on a community level. It's not really feasible or possible. And it has to be much broader than you could do a clinical trial on a community. We use observational studies, and those have been done, as it says on the slides, lung disease, STDs, chronic alcohol use, and a couple of others. But there are many reviews and studies that support the safety of community water fluoridation. Studies in the 60s and 70s, right up to last year. Archives of Toxicology was one of them. We've been on a little more. The National Toxicology Program. The work that the EPA has done, and something called the Community Services Task Force, which makes recommendations across many areas of health promotion and prevention activities. This is something we often hear, that it's mass medication. It's not a medicine. We add, and so do other countries, add certain components to other foods that or beverages that we drink. folic acid, vitamin D, calcium, iodine to salt. And this is not a medication. Here too, that it doesn't make water safer to drink the way chlorine does, but it does make it healthier to drink. And that's one of the points. And I also, to make sure that I get to say it, is that I've been working in this area for 35, 36 years and have developed an incredible amount of, Mr. Smith, incredible amount of respect for people who run our schools. They, what I have found is that they may not like something or agree with what it is, but when the community directs them to do something, or when it's the thing that should be done, they do it right. They take that work very seriously. It's been something I learned a lot about. I'm not an engineer. I should have been an English major. And I really think that they did a phenomenal job. And I just want to make sure we get to hear that.
Thank you.
So we did want to talk a little bit about fluorosis, and we do have a couple slides on IQ. So if you want to go to the next slide.
Sure. I think we can just do this very briefly. So dental fluorosis is something that happens where you end up with, I think I talked about the Colorado ground stain, that would be severe fluorosis. It gets classified clinically as very mild and mild. Can you skip to the next slide, actually? Go to the next slide. No?
No.
Okay, well, we're stuck on this one.
Oh, there it goes.
There we go. So I think that the important thing here is that at a conversational distance, and this would be representative of that, you're not going to notice most fluorosis that get seen. And then the other thing is that a lot of conditions that affect the teeth can mimic dental fluorosis. And so as a dentist, when I see someone that I suspect might be fluorosis, I don't actually know that. It could be because they had too many fevers as a child, or they had antibiotics as a child, or they were, knocked down on the playground and the baby teeth hit the adult teeth, they reached the baby teeth, the adult teeth is still developing. And so unless you actually do an assay of the tooth structure, you won't know for sure what you're seeing as fluorosis. So I think it actually gets over categorized in this country.
And the adult smile there, she has like a little white spot on one of her front teeth. The child, there's a little bit that goes across, and that's the other thing. So this is something that happens at a given point in time. You're going to see it symmetrically across this one spot. So that's because you'll see lots of, if you follow this process through for the next some months, you're going to see lots of pictures like this. And you can go to the next one.
In fairness,
Oh, sure.
we're just about out of time.
Oh, all right.
So let's skip ahead a couple slides here.
Yeah, all right. So we were going to just hit on that and
Let's go to this one again.
yeah.
So there's a 2017 EPA review that was really significant. When that report came out, that was really big.
I stood to my 15 minutes, and this
Sure,
woman
study.
is now into
Back
her
orders.
7th minute.
Do you want to address the recent research in Spain? Just
Yeah.
before we run out of time.
Okay. I live in Hollow and I left my house about 3 o'clock and an email came in right then, so I have to take it off my phone. Sorry about that. I still have not gotten used to people cleaning up their phones. So there's been a study from Spain.
On.
Did a comparison to the study that Dr. Connett reported on by Green and their colleagues in the JAMA Pediatrics paper. And the bottom line was that IQ scores increased with increasing exposure to fluoride in boys. No association was found between some chemical abbreviation and a mental development index score. But scores across the whole pregnancies, those MUFCR across the whole pregnancy. Scores in boys were greater for verbal, performance, numeric, and memory domains, respectively, and for general cognitive index. For girls, there was not any cognitive score significantly associated, including other toxicant levels, quality of family context, or any deprivation, which is the term for, what was lacking in the environment, did not substantially change the results. So this study that was apparently just published contradicts this other one that finds loss of IQ. The other thing I would like to understand better, look it up, but that would be rude, is how stable IQ is. Understanding do an IQ test on a 3-year-old, you're not going to get the same results if you do an IQ test on a 6-year-old or on a 60-year-old. There is some variation. See, that's what happens when you play with it. So, do you want us? We can
Well,
stop and see if
Yeah.
there's questions.
Good question,
Yeah.
Thank you,
question.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
So comments, questions? Laura?
I have a question. So part of this is about equity and access and oral health at home with toothpaste and some of the data that you showed around the increased numbers of cavities that kids are having in non-fluoridated systems. Can you speak to dental access in Maine and that preventative care to deal and or like symptomatic care access to deal with dental issues for children in Maine?
What a great question. All right. Let me just switch tapes. Dental access for kids in Maine really depends on where you live and what resources a family has. The availability of dental care in Maine is better than it was, like when I started doing that work. But we're still not evenly distributed throughout the state. If you live here in Orono and you have resources that are available in Bangor, you access to dental care may be tricky depending on your financial resources, but it's probably there. If you live 100 miles west of here, that's going to be a lot harder. Somebody has to take a child out of school for a day and take time out, a full day off from work. And the cost of that care is significant. That's going to impact their ability to access that care. I think the pandemic started out being a very threat to the access that we have, but has turned out that the people who run dental clinics and the dental practices have risen to that occasion by trying to make that availability come back to where it was. But it's a challenge, and anything we can do to prevent the development of this disease is what we want to do. I don't know if that really answered your question. I don't have the numbers anymore.
I'm hearing from folks that they're having a hard time hearing. So we need to project, and when you speak, even though you might want to be talking to somebody over here, you got to remember to speak to the owl.
Okay.
Other comments, questions? Anybody?
I have a question. So first is to Tom, is our job not to determine the healthfulness or unhealthfulness of fluoride? Our job is to determine whether our community should hold the referendum.
Correct.
And could I ask Judy and Dr. Rowe, if your intention is that the evidence presented by Dr. Connett is incorrect? Yes. So you refute that. So I do not have the expertise or ability at sitting at the table at this time to determine who's evidence is correct. So I'm not sure that I'm in a position where I can make a decision as to whether the community should go or not. Go ahead.
May I just say, Jeff, Patrick is fine, by the
Yeah.
way. I honestly feel that to a large extent, I'm in the same boat as you, right? I am not a statistician. I'm not a toxicologist. I'm a clinically trained dentist who did additional work in public health, but that did not make me an expert in toxicology. So what I do is I say, okay, what does the CDC say? And they've never, after reviewing studies, said, oh yes, this one's a game changer. We should usually stop doing this nationally. I say, what does the EPA say? Same result. There are high-level scientific national bodies that have looked at this and said there's no evidence that there's a harm here. Okay, and so individual studies, I think, shouldn't be relied on. It's the consensus of the tens of thousands of studies that have been done over decades. We should really be looking at. But when it comes to COVID, I say, what does the CDC say? When it comes to fluoride, I also say, what does the CDC say? And I look at what science they are.
And the IQ studies, I'm gonna hold the mask out, maybe.
You could even,
Yeah, the IQ studies are frightening. Anything that would impact intellectual ability and development is a serious thing. There's no question. But the evidence in these studies has been termed weak by an organization which I think is an equivalent to our CDC, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. And their comments were that there were multiple limitations, some stat terms, non-homogeneous distribution of data, potential errors and biases in the estimation of maternal fluoride exposure and an IQ measurement, and the uncontrolled potential important confounding factors. And confounding factors, I don't want to oversimplify, but if you're not comparing apples to apples, then it's the possibility of confounding factors. If you don't take into account everything that could have made two people different and control for that, then it confounds the study. There was another slide that I had, and I didn't put it in either the PowerPoint or what I have with me, that each of those researchers, like Christine Till and the Green Study, themselves at some point in their reports said things like, and I don't mean this to be a direct quote, but they said things like, we need to do more research. This is something we don't understand thoroughly. And a couple of other reports have said these results do not have impact on the level of fluoride used in community water fluoridation to prevent duplicate. This would be for higher levels of fluoride found naturally with multiple exposures. In some countries with coal burning plants, there's a lot of fluoride that's released into the atmosphere, then it rains, then it goes into the ground, and you have a lot more exposure at much higher levels.
I realize this is council discussion time, but I do have two questions.
Please.
The first one is can any of our experts tell me how many communities in Maine have already voted to stop fluoridation, like have started and stopped? Do we know of?
Well, communities and water districts. In 2016, the 7 communities that were served by the Kennebunk, that are served by the Kennebunk Port and Wells Water District voted to stop fluoridation in 2016. And they have had it in place for about 12 or 14 years, I'm not sure. And then on Jackman and Moose River, I cannot remember what year that was. And 2 towns on MDI. Those are the ones that stick in my mind. And the ones on MDI, I did it during the town meeting and in the summer. It was not the right time to have a vote. Very, very small number of people. That's my personal opinion.
And my second question, during the presentation, you talked about naturally occurring fluoride. And I'm just trying to understand the difference, if there is any, between naturally occurring fluoride, and say it wrong, I'm gonna try, and fluorosilicic acid there. Usually Boyd has to save me every time.
You know, they call it silly acid.
That was, well,
Yeah.
yeah, at the point we do.
Right.
He just does it to see me squirm.
Fluoride occurs when water.
Jeez,
Like
I've got my hand up here.
Yeah, just a moment.
across a rock that carries granite, appetite. So not hungry appetite, APATITE. And fluoride exists, and we said this from the beginning, in all water. You know, it's trace amounts, certain waters, surface water, like rivers might be 0.2 parts per million, 0.2 rather. Groundwater could be one part per million to over 5, and we do have a few groundwater wells in Maine with high levels of fluoride. And the ocean is typically 0.8 to 1.4. So we're not adding fluoride to a source that has no fluoride. We're adjusting it up to the level that is proven to help prevent tooth decay. And there are several chemicals, and Boyd would be better at this than me. There's sodium fluoride, there's hydroxylic acid.
Yep.
What's the third one?
I don't know the third one.
There is a
Sodium,
third.
the sodium is the
Yeah.
powerful one.
So there are 3. And the third one I think is commonly used. And they have pros and cons. It's not a fun chemical to work with. I would be lying and being deceptive if I didn't say that. But neither are the other chemicals that you work with, right?
Correct.
Dr.
It's a
Quinn, you had
mineral,
your-
it's not a chemical.
you had your hand up, and I want to recognize
Sorry,
you.
yeah.
Yes, I do want to note that I stuck to the rules. I was told that I had 15 minutes and I gave you 15 minutes.
You actually spoke for about 18 and a half minutes.
Okay, well, the other person has doubled that almost, over 30 minutes, and is still now dominating the question time. I don't think this is fair. There are a number of things that she said, which I categorically disagree with. Let's take one, a very important one. She pointed out that the Fluoride Action Network did petition the EPA to ban the deliberate addition of fluoride to the drinking water in 2017. And as expected, the EPA rejected our petition. But on its merits, so they said. So that's why we took the EPA to court on this. And this is currently being determined by a federal law judge as to whether our case has merits. We argued the science and the EPA argued the science. And I think it would be very interesting for you to hear that the EPA didn't use its own experts. They used experts from Exponent, a corporation that represents all kinds of chemical industries and defending all kinds of different chemicals with their typical tactics. So I don't want you to run away with the impression that the EPA has dealt with the IQ studies. And again, the IQ studies that I talked about are of the highest quality, the best quality. I've been following this issue since 1996. In fact, the first year I got involved was the publication of the first 2 studies from China. There have now been over 70 studies which show a lowering of IQ. And some of those, yes, were done in India and China at higher levels, as the previous speaker mentioned. But the key thing about the studies that have been done since 2017, funded by the US government, is that they were done at exposure levels that are currently experienced in fluoridated communities. So you can't argue that fluoride only lowers IQ at much higher doses. That is incorrect. In fact, the CDC Oral Health Division Director said that at a public meeting, and we corrected him. We wrote to the director of the CDC and say he's absolutely wrong. That the levels at which fluoride had been lowered in these US funded studies were done at the exposure levels of fluoridated communities. Another point I would like to correct, or at least clarify, the speaker, previous speaker, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. The previous speaker said that the reduction of tooth decay attributable to water fluoridation is a reduction of 25% in a lifetime, over a lifetime. That is a very deceptive number. That 25% comes from a paper by Brunel and Carlos from the National Institute of Dental Research. It was the largest survey research of tooth decay in the United States. They looked at 39,000 children in the United States. And when they compared children who with children who'd always lived in a non-fluoridated community, the average difference in tooth decay, the average for children 5 to 17, the average saving in tooth decay was 0.6 of one tooth surface. Now, there are about 5 tooth surfaces to most teeth and 4 to the cutting teeth. So 0.6 of one tooth surface. And when you make this into a relative difference, you've got a relative difference, it does come to 18%. The 0.6 out of the total number of tooth decay in the fluoridated, non-fluoridated community, that percentage was 18%. And then they did some hand waving and they said, well, we'll allow for toothpaste, etc. And they put it up to 25%. Well, 25% sounds very impressive, doesn't it? 25% saving in tooth decay. You're thinking of a quarter of the teeth in someone's mouth are saved, when in actual fact, we're talking about 0.6 of a tooth surface. And to put it another way, the total saving for an individual is one cavity in a lifetime. That's what you can attribute to water fluoridation. But even this, I must come back and say, the quality of studies which shows that fluoride lowers IQ in children and increases ADHD symptoms, the quality of that research is far better, far more superior to any study that has shown a lowering of tooth decay ascribed to water fluoridation. And the speaker was correct when she pointed out there has been no randomized clinical trial, no RCT, which is the gold standard for any drug. If you want to show a drug is effective, you do an RCT. In over 70 years, they have not done an RCT to demonstrate that swallowing fluoride lowers tooth decay. And there's so many factors which affect tooth decay, including income. Unless you have scrupulous control over all the confounding variables, you can get any result you want. And that's why you need a randomized clinical trial to deal with that plethora of confounding factors. And they've never done that. And don't take my word for it. The gold standard for judging the quality of epidemiological studies is the, Ellen, what is the gold standard, the Goldman,
Is it the randomized control study?
yeah, the gold standard for epidemiological, which we're always quoted. The name has just escaped me.
Escapes me, George.
Anyway, the gold standard for judging, making a judgment on the effectiveness of epidemiological studies. And the name might come back to me before the end of this. I'm sorry, senior moment here. This was published in 2015, looking at the effectiveness.
Cochrane.
Cochrane. The Cochrane review is the gold standard, and they could not find any high quality studies which showed a reduction in tooth decay in adults, no high quality studies which showed that when you stop tooth decay, stop fluoridation, you increase tooth decay. And the studies that our friend cited there are very, very suspect. The study from Windsor is a government, self-serving government review. The study done in Calgary was reviewed by our senior scientist and had a critique published of that. I'm afraid we're in a situation.
Dr. Cornett, I think we'd have to stop you there. We've gone on quite a while on that, and I want to make sure that our council members have an opportunity to express their opinions. So thank you for the information.
Thank you for allowing me to correct some of those issues.
Yes, Tom, I was going to ask, is this, are we still asking questions, or are we weighing in on our take on?
I think we're beyond the asking question part, unless there's something to really.
I don't have a question. I was just going to.
We need to go what our next steps might be. We're not here to decide whether we're going to remove fluoride or leave fluoride. We're here to decide whether we're going to move forward.
I would like to comment on that, if that's okay. Okay. So, as has been said a couple of times, the question before us is not whether it's safe or whether it should be in the water, but whether to put this out for a vote. I'm not inclined to do that for a number of reasons. On the one hand, we have the weight of decades and decades of peer-reviewed, repeatable studies supporting that fluoridation of municipal water supplies is a good thing. And we have the recommendation of the CDC, the NIH, which I don't know, there was discussion of an NIH-funded study, but the NIH, as recently as this year, has published its guidelines on the safety and the uses of this in the water supply. So the NIH, the ADA, I mean, that's just in this country, these major organizations still finding it perfectly safe and beneficial to the community. On the other hand, so we have that on one hand, and then on the other hand, we have a relatively small but very vocal group of individuals that are, touting a number of studies that sound very alarming, but they also have been called into question for a variety of reasons from many experts. The tactics used by some of these individuals really seem to me to rest on fear mongering. Some of these things sound very scary, but again, a lot of experts question these studies. And in particular, resting an argument, for example, like what I find to be fear mongering, resting an argument on IQ tests is inherently problematic. IQ tests are fundamentally flawed and they shouldn't be used as a sole measure of intelligence, though even the study that that's taken from has been criticized for its methods and the conclusions drawn from them around IQ. But we also have to think about and remember, as a couple people have mentioned, that this is an equity issue. And many of the small but vocal group of individuals opposed to fluoridation frequently argue that anyone can simply use fluoride toothpaste and they can go to the dentist. Well, that isn't the reality for many people. I myself went a decade without dental care for economic reasons. And that's just not everybody's reality. And the cost of dental repair resulting from a lack of fluoride, it's extremely expensive, which is also an equity issue. So at the end of the day, I have to say that, again, I'm not an expert and it's not my decision, to make about whether it should be in the water supply. But in terms of putting it out to the public for a vote, I see this as unnecessary. As Patrick said, I'm not an expert in the fields required to determine the safety of the practice, which is why we have the CDC. And as long as this is a recommended practice, I feel comfortable leaving it as is, and I do not feel that it's necessary to put it out to a public vote.
Thanks, Megan. Any other comments?
I also looked up the CDC recommendations, and since we are listening to the CDC for the vaccines and all of the things that we are now relying on our science and our evidence-based practice, I am in agreement. I am not, if the public, demands that we put this on a referendum, but I'm not inclined to go in that direction.
Anything else? Any of our remote participants from Veazie have any comments they'd like to make? So I think we've heard some information, we've asked some questions, and we've got some reaction from a couple of council members. It seemed logical, I think, to think on this issue, to bring it up at a workshop again, and make sure that we get some consensus on this, and then just move forward based on the results of that workshop, at least for Orono.
So I would be looking at November 8th. Seems like it's going to be a fairly light agenda. So I will just add this as a workshop on the end so that you guys can discuss, and I then can communicate with Mark back and forth.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'll just tell you, I haven't done this kind of thing in a number of years, and I didn't know what to expect. I don't like to argue with people, so I wasn't going to get, I just don't. My sister might disagree, but I want to thank Megan, because those are the points that if I were not trying to remain neutral and providing the best information that I can, I will say that those are the points I would have made, and I thank you for that. I'm giving to each of the town managers a copy of the ADA's reference book. It's pretty comprehensive. It also says the third type is sodium. I can't do
Oh,
it.
sorry.
So, yeah, so, but it's the least commonly used. There's a Q&A sheet that I can email, so it'll be available electronically. And also a page with some links to some of these resources. I did check all the links in the last couple of days, so they should work. And it can be available for further questions. Both Sophie and Mark know where to find me, and Patrick is yours. He's on your school board. You should be able to find him. And we'd be happy to either try to answer these questions or to find answers for you. And that's really all I can say.
Well, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, it was a beautiful ride up. Thank you.
Are we all set, folks? Then we will declare our workshop adjourned. We'll visit this topic again on November 8th.
Oh, that's fine. I kind of know that.
Yeah.